All right, well, that was a fun introduction. Let's put that. Is there a slide? How do I do the first slide? Well, there. Oh, it is up there. I'm looking over there. It's over here. All right, this is my family. My wife, Vinny, is Thai American. Her father's from Thailand, and her mother's from Texas. And our three boys are Elias, Sila, and Ezra. And as Barbara mentioned, we live on an organic farm in Boulder, Colorado now. And that's part of my story. How do I work this? Oh, that's all right. So just to give you the background, I was born in Beirut during the Civil War in the 70s. My mother and father were, my mom is from New Jersey. My dad is the guy over there. And my dad was working on the translation of the Bible in the Arabic language. Living in Beirut. Beirut was a war zone. Very few people crossed the front lines. There was a line that ran through the city called the Green Line. On the west side were the Muslim militias. On the east side were the so-called Christian militias. And the no man's land was that green line. And my dad would cross, there it is, there's the map. My dad would cross that line every day to go to work. And we saw miracles. I grew up in a war zone, and I don't remember it. People say, oh, I'm so sorry that happened. No, it was great. We had so much fun. I mean, the parents there's days when they couldn't go to work and you couldn't go to school, and we all went down in the basement. It was great. And we would go on the balcony and watch tank battles down in the city, and we would pray together so fervently and sing. And we saw God move because there was just so much fear and worry, but at the same time, we just felt the presence of God so clearly, and that was wonderful. And then I got mad at my parents because they dragged me to America, and I ended up in Boulder, Colorado. As a little kid, I would have rather been in Beirut, but Boulder's a very nice place, but I didn't really get along very well there. As an immigrant, as a kid, I was rejected by the other kids. I lived in the school that I went to was sort of a farming, rural kind of area, and the kids didn't really like different people, and I was called all kinds of names and got in lots of fights and wanted to kill myself even as a little kid. Didn't know that God had a plan for me, but I just wanted to go back to Lebanon and be there. But got involved at that age with a farm that was a neighbor. The neighbors were our neighbors, and they had a farm, and that's where I really began to develop a love for agriculture and the land and the soil, and that was part of who God was making me to be. And we live on the farm now. We have that as some of our income, and other part is through ministry and support. And we raise cattle, we milk cows, and we have pigs, and Barbara told you, and we raise garlic and other things. And we disciple people. We bring people in. We have 3 or 4 people at a time that stay with us on the farm and work on the farm, and we do discipleship, we do training and teaching and preparing people for a lifetime of ministry. And so that's what my vocation is. I also wanted to share with you about this business project in Zambia. And maybe I'll skip ahead to this slide here. This is Richard Chimbwambwa. And Richard is part of a community in northwestern province of Zambia. Zambia is a Christian nation. It's officially declared a Christian nation, where most of the European countries, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they don't call themselves Christian nations, at least not anymore, but Zambia is, and it's very much also a Christian heartland. And these people are brothers and sisters in faith, but they're also our partners in reaching the lost. And so as we began to be involved with Africa and teaching and training them to reach Muslims within Africa and hopefully beyond Africa, we realized that sending wasn't really happening and it wasn't really feasible. In this community where Richard lives, the average income per household is $75 a year. They're farmers, so they feed themselves, but they don't have any cash. How many of them would it take tithing? And believe me, when you have $75 a year, it is very hard to give $7.50 to ministry. How many people would it take to send a missionary to, let's say, Egypt? It's very difficult financially. But as we worked with them and saw their passion and their desire to serve the Lord in ministry, we realized we had to get involved either on a deeper level in helping them come up with resources to get this thing going, or else we have to really kind of, if nothing's going to happen, it's not a good investment of time. But what I realized in having conversations with the pastors there in Zambia, they said things like, just because we're poor, does that mean the Great Commission isn't for us? And of course, my first response was, no, the Great Commission is for everybody. But my second response was, who told you that you're poor? Because I look around in this beautiful country with the eyes of a farmer, and I see riches because they had fertile soil, they had a wonderful climate, you can grow year-round, you have water, they have all these beautiful people that are hardworking, are dedicated to the Lord, and really actually knowledgeable about farming and things like that. And so we said, well, maybe there's some things we could do to turn the riches that you do have, because you have riches. It's really kind of the promised land. When you read the description in Deuteronomy, it talks about the land flowing with milk and honey, out of whose hills you can dig copper. And all of those things describe Zambia perfectly. And so we said, well, let's try to figure out a way to turn these riches into cash, so we can pay for plane tickets and support missionaries. And so we started a business, and we now have about 1,200 farmers. Richard is one of them, and their income has gone up because we have just worked together. They're partners. This is not a project to help them. We're partners together in trying to reach the lost. But because I had some background and had some ideas, and we tried some things, and they produce organic beeswax and honey, and we ship it out, and we also create some other products. We do some essential oils and things like that, and we produce that product, which is a lip balm called ZAMBIA, and that's in about 500 stores in the States, and I'm not sure how many in Canada. We are in a few places in Canada. But if you're interested in helping with that, you can help us get this placed into stores, and that sends missionaries. Because one of the things that they can do in Zambia that we can't do in developed countries is produce organic beeswax, because bees go in a very big area, and we don't have that much. If there's a road in the middle of your acreage, that's a state, or a government road, they may spray for weeds and stuff, and so it can't be organic. But in Zambia, we have an entire area of about 50,000 square kilometers that's certified organic, and we have 1,200 beekeepers like this gentleman here. And when I talked to Richard, the reason I put his picture up, I went into a village, one of our villages. It takes 30 hours to get to Zambia. Then you drive for 2 days to the end of the road, and then there's a river, and you have to go in a canoe across the river, and then you have to walk from there for another day, and then you get to Richard's village. And I wanted to see if we were all on the same page, so I said, Richard, why am I here? Why are we doing this project together? And he pointed up at the sky, and he said, you see those clouds that follow the airplanes? He said, down here, we've been watching people fly over. And they have nothing to do with us. But now, because you're here, we're working together so that we'll put our people on those airplanes, and go share the gospel with those lost people. Wow. Isn't that powerful? So we're working together, and then it was real exciting. Pastor Barry, who's a leader over over the missions department of many churches in Zambia, came with me to Lebanon. We visited the church there, and we're getting set to send the first missionaries to Lebanon. We've sent them so far just within Africa, but now we're ready to send Africans also to the Arab world. So that's one of the things that I'm doing. Well, our title is Reaching Obstinate Hearts. And here's one, Obstinate Heart. This guy's name is Modibo. I met him last year in the fall, in October, in Togo, West Africa. I went to Togo to work with a young man named Dovane, and he and his wife she's from North Carolina, he's from Togo, and they have a farm that they are starting up in a border region of Togo between Muslims and the Ebe people, who are farmers, and do voodoo, and some of them are Christians. And so the Fulani people, which are the Muslims, are the ones that keep the cattle. And so when we were looking at we're helping him start this farm as a ministry center for his personal ministry. And when I told him, look, we need to get some cattle to bring fertility, because their soils are almost all washed away. This used to be rainforest. It's cut down. It looks green now, but then part of the year there's not even any water in the wells, because there's no topsoil to hold the moisture. And so I said, if we're going to build soil, we need cattle. And I said, if we're going to bring cattle, is there anybody that has experience? He said, well, those Muslim people over there that we want to reach, they're the ones that have all the experience with the cattle, because the Fulani, like Modibo, they're cattle keepers. And that's their traditional occupation. And there's Modibo with a couple of cows. So I said, you need to go and hire one of these Fulani, or more than one, and we'll start keeping cattle. So he told Modibo that this Arab guy is going to come and teach you about how we want to keep these cattle. And so I taught them about portable electric fences and rotational grazing and building fertility and so on. But when I first got there, Modibo and his brother Hamidou were there, and I just basically got out of the car, came up to them to introduce myself, and he put out his hand, and he held my hand, and he pulled me close, and he said, I'm Modibo, I am a very strong Muslim. And I said, why? And he was kind of surprised. And he said, well, because my parents are Muslims. And I said, well, alhamdulillah, by the grace of God, I'm a Christian. And he said, why? Aren't you an Arab? I said, well, yes, but by the grace of God, I would love to answer the question why, but it will take some time. Do you have time for me to answer that question? He said, yes. I said, well, when we finish with our work, I will answer the question, why am I not a Muslim? Why am I a Christian? And so we worked together, and we began to talk about how in this part of the world there's tension between the livestock people and the farmers. They're always fighting. And I said, this reminds me, I told Hamidou, Modibo, and the other Ebe people that were part of the team, I said, this reminds me of the story in the Bible of Cain and Abel. I said, ever since there were two brothers, these two brothers, one of them was a livestock keeper, and the other was a farmer, and they had conflict. And I said, do you know about Cain and Abel? They said, yes. I said, which one killed which? They said, we don't know. I said, guess. Which one killed which? Was it the farmer that killed the livestock keeper, or did the livestock man kill the farmer? Then they started laughing. They said, oh, we know. It was the farmer that killed the stockman. And I said, yes, but why? And Hamidou, Modibo's brother, said, no maize, no corn has ever eaten a cow. Because the cows are always getting into the corn, and the farmers are getting mad because they put a lot of work into that. And they're going to go chase those guys down and knock them over the head. And so I said, but today we are going to heal the broken family of Adam. Because we are going to work together. And we're going to improve this farm together. Cattle and farming together. But then I said, we also need you to become brothers. We need you to become brothers. So that night I sat down with Hamidou and I explained to him, that's later, I explained to him why I'm not a Muslim. And this is what I told him. I said, first of all, what do you believe? He said, I'm a Muslim. I said, okay, and who is your prophet? He said, Muhammad. I said, okay, and what is your book? And he said, the Quran. I said, okay, your prophet is Muhammad, your book is the Quran. Do you know what I believe? He said, you're a Christian. I said, yes. Do you know who my prophet is? He said, Jesus. I said, do you know what my book is? He said, I don't know. I said, you don't know what book the Christians read? He said, oh, Bible. I said, yes, Bible. Which prophet gave the Bible? He said, I don't know. I said, okay, let me explain to you. So I took the Bible and I turned to the first page. I said, this is the part of the story of Adam and Eve. You've heard of them. Yes. And we go on through, and Cain and Abel and Seth and Abraham and Noah and Isaac and Ishmael, and they've heard these names, they know these people. And here's the part about Moses. And I went on through the stories of the Old Testament. Here's the book of Joshua, here's the book of the King David, where he wrote down his songs. You've heard of King David? Yes, of course. And here's the book of Solomon, Sulaiman, who they know, and so on. Prophet after prophet, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Nehemiah, all of these names. I read every one of those small books, the names of those small books of the prophets. And then I got to the New Testament. I said, here are 4 witnesses to the message of Jesus. And then went on to the Apostle Paul and Peter, James, and John, ending with the Revelation. I said, this is not one book from one prophet. In fact, this is 66 books from many, many prophets. I said, now let me ask you a question. If in your village something bad happened, and the elders of the village need to call witnesses together to explain what happened. And here comes one guy, and he comes over here and he says, this is what I saw. And he speaks very nicely, very eloquently. People listen to him. They're convinced by what he says. But then over here, 66 people come. And they testify with one voice and they say, no, that's not what we saw. We saw this. I asked him, Modibo, who would you believe? Now, normally, I would expect, I've only asked this question one other time, which was in a tent in southern Lebanon, an actual Bedouin tent. And that guy also came to Christ. So maybe I need to use this one more often. But what I would expect is what that guy in the Bedouin tent said, I got you. You got me. You know, I see what you're getting at. But that's not what Modibo said. He said, I would believe the 66. So I asked a follow-up question. I said, so what does that make him? And he said, a liar. Whoa. I said, now, I'm not here to say anything bad about your religion or your people or your prophet. But for me, I will serve God, who is testified about by many witnesses, the great cloud of witnesses in Hebrews. And I began to share with him more about the gospel. And at the end of that conversation, late in the night, at the fire, as it was dying down, I don't know why they even have fires. It's so hot. He was saying that the cattle were cold. I said, if my cattle were here, they'd be hot, even at night. They would be panting. But those are different cattle. Anyway, late at night, he said, I want you to baptize me. So what do you say to that? Yes. Well, this is what I said. Immersion. This is what I said. I said, can you pay the price? Because we don't want to just dunk them. And I mean, that's great, but are they going to walk with Jesus? So I said, can you pay the price? He said, yes. I said, what's going to happen when your father hears that I baptized you? And he thought about that for a minute. And he said, I need to go and talk to my father. I said, do you mean you're going to go ask him for his permission? He said, no, but I need him to hear it from me. I said, okay, well, don't sleep. Go to your village. Go tell him now. So in the middle of the night, he started walking. I said, if you tell him, come back to me tomorrow and I'll baptize you. So he came back the next day and he brought this piece of paper. And I don't know if this is not going to mean anything to very many people, but this is a spell casting amulet or charm. And he bought this. It was very expensive, and the imam who sold him this thing taught him magic words, powerful words that would be able to protect him from evil. And he said, I need to burn this. I need to leave that stuff behind. And so together we burned it, and then we baptized him. Now, I thought it was very interesting. I asked him before I baptized him, I said, what did your father say? And he said, and this is what the father said. He said to his son, you are making big problems for our family. But on the day of judgment, you will stand for yourself. So you do whatever seems best to you. And his brother Hamidou, when I baptized him, Hamidou looked moved. And so I asked him, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? He said, he didn't want to talk about it. And I said, do you want me to baptize you too? He said, no. He said, but I'll be watching. Modibo is still walking with the Lord, and I've been following up with him. And the guy in the camouflage on that side, he's Dovane, that's his boss, that's the missionary, and he's been discipling him. Why am I sharing you with this particular story? Our topic is reaching obstinate hearts. When Modibo came up to me, by all appearances, he didn't have to say, I'm a very strong Muslim. 24 hours later, he was a very strong Christian. So, where's the obstinate heart? It was, in this case, a surface, a veil. Now, when the veil is removed, things can be different. And that's basically the core of what I want to share with you, is that obstinate hearts are sometimes not what they appear. You don't know. And you won't know until you're bold enough to get out there and start knocking on doors, poking at hornets' nests, and getting yourself into trouble. So let's go do it. But the first obstinate hearts I want to talk about are not their obstinate hearts, but our obstinate hearts. And that's really, I think, the bigger obstacle. The bigger obstacle is, are we going to get our obstinate hearts moving? Now, I'm not going to be too harsh with you, because you're here on a Friday when you have other things you could be doing. And so obviously you have a desire. But within our churches, within our Christian communities, we do have obstinate hearts. Because people sit back and wait for the Lord to call them when He already has. He said, go. Jesus said, go therefore into all the nations and make disciples, baptizing them, and so on. So why are we not doing that? And we can say, well, we are doing that. We put our money in the plate and so on and so forth. But is that a box that we're ticking? Or is this the passionate purpose of our lives on earth? If we really ask ourselves, why are we here? Are we not in heaven? Did God just kind of late and He just forgot about us down here? Or do we have a purpose here beyond ourselves? Well, we can answer that question. But here are sort of the secrets to our own obstinate hearts, and I want us to look inside first before we start looking at those obstinate hearts over there, because there's plenty of obstinacy to go around. But when we look at our own obstinate hearts, the first thing I want us to ask ourselves is, do we have apathy? Do we really care? Now again, you guys showed up here today, so probably you care. But are there others in our community that are apathetic? Do we need to poke them? Do we need to stir them a little bit and say, hey, do you really care? Because apathy leads us to withdraw from the realm. Sometimes we have great opportunities that are thrust into our laps, and we just don't care enough because we have our own program. Well, I was gonna go shopping this afternoon. I was gonna go down to Cabela's this afternoon. I was gonna go catch a show. And here's an opportunity, and we just don't care. But the second one is fear. And I want to just ask us to be honest. Does anybody want to just be honest and say that your issue is apathy? Okay. You know, reactions, we all have reactions. The more we're honest about them, the more we pull them out into the open, the better we can deal with them. We just have to identify it. Thank you. Fear. Anybody want to say, let's go on record, and I've got some fear when it comes to this subject? I talked about this briefly in my breakout session yesterday, but fear is an incredibly powerful motivator. And it motivates us to be silent and to be even secretive. And it's true in advertising. I mean, that's a big motivator. That's why lots of advertising is built around fear of embarrassment or fear of missing out on something. But it's also true when it comes to interacting with other people, especially people from a different culture, especially people from an Arabic culture or a Muslim culture, which is a little bit scary. Cross-cultural stuff is scary anyway, for anybody. But when you have a culture that's so aggressive and so confident and so they talk too loud, they talk loud and they argue, then that can be scary. But some people are scared for different reasons. I mentioned this yesterday. Some people are scared because they think people are going to get blown up. Some people are scared because our society is getting taken over and nobody's paying attention and caring about it. Some people are scared because they might say the wrong thing or offend someone or break some cultural rule that they don't know about. So when we get a little bit of cultural awareness, a little bit of cultural knowledge, we say, wow, things are so different in that culture. What if I accidentally do something that's terribly offensive? Let me just free you from that one right there. It'll be so funny. It'll be a great joke if you go out and make the worst possible thing, as long as you love through that, whatever that was. I mean, they understand. They know that you're not part of their culture, and that you don't know better, and so we'll all laugh about it later. But the only way that that's not going to happen is if you don't push through it. Because if you have a smile on your face, if you really are loving someone, they'll see that. They'll understand that it's just not from malice, but just from a lack of understanding. And you push through that, and it'll be a fun story later on. I was going to think of some of those examples, but of cultural snafus, but I can't think of one. The only one I can think of, there was the Iranian woman who was babysitting for a Christian family. And somebody called the house phone. Well, this was back before cell phones. And so they called the house phone. She picked up the phone, and they said, well, is Mr. and Mrs. Baker there? And can I talk to Mr. Baker? And she said, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Baker passed away. She meant they left. But her English wasn't perfect, so she said, Mr. Baker passed away. And on the other line, you could just hear the impact of the... And they said, oh, no. When did this happen? She said, oh, just about 15 minutes ago. And they said, oh, that's terrible. Well, can I talk to Mrs. Baker? Well, she passed away too. They passed away together. And then they just hung up the phone. They thought that was just a crank call or something. Anyway, it all becomes a good story afterwards. Yes?
They asked her, who are you?
Oh, the end of the story. Oh yeah, they said, so who is this? And she said, well, she wanted to say, I am their guest. But Iranians have vowels that are a little different. So she said, I am their ghost. That's when they really thought, this person is just joking with me, and they hung up the phone. So anyway, fear, what does the Bible say about fear? It's a deficit of love. Fear is a love deficiency. Perfect love casts away fear. So if you really are afraid, if you're afraid to kind of go over and talk to somebody, I mean, we are afraid to talk to people that aren't different from us, right? We are afraid to talk about, to go up and talk to a stranger, you know, in high school or at work sometimes. There's just a barrier of just, you know, being a little weird. Well, let's be weird for Jesus. And you don't need to be afraid of that, because that's fear of man. And perfect love casts away fear. And that gives us boldness. A third one that's really a strong barrier is anger and fury. And some of us, you know, certainly in America, you know, 9/11 changed a lot of things for a lot of people. And I had a very, very strong mentor for me who was a sweet, believing man in his church, always taking people in, always counseling youth and so on. And he had 2 sons that were in the U.S. military. And he did not lose his sons, but they were in harm's way. And one day he said, we just need to nuke them all. We just need to go over there and nuke them all. And I said, oh my goodness, how can you say that? You're a Christian man. And you have that level of anger that you would just contemplate that. And of course, we've seen that even in Canada, that kind of anger towards Muslims that becomes a source of conflict. There's pastors there was that pastor in Florida that burned the Quran. Well, why? Because he wants one less Quran in the world. Okay, throw it in the garbage and nobody will know the difference. You're trying to make a statement. Because you're angry and you want to spark conflict. Or, you know, when I was younger, this was mine. Anger. Anybody want to put their hand up for that one? Yeah. When I was younger, I was talking to my brother over there about this, is that I used to argue with Muslims. That was my ministry. My ministry was arguing with Muslims. And you know what? I'm smart. And I've got experience. And I've read the Quran. And I have my information and my arguments. And I watch the tapes. And I go and I practice. And I'm in the shower and I practice my arguments. And then when I get there with a real live Muslim, I'm going to prove them they're wrong. Guess what? That doesn't go very well. Because strife and conflict, how many of us, you know, when you're in the middle of that kind of a heated argument, do you say, you know what, that's a really good point. I'm going to rethink everything that I just said since I've been yelling. That's not how people work. And so this fury, that can be a real barrier to ministry. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have people out there who are doing apologetics. But, you know, that's not the focus of our ministry all the time. And certainly if you're doing apologetics, if you are arguing the issues of the faith with the Muslim, if you have anger when you're doing that, you need to stop. You need to stop because you're not helping. You're doing more harm than good. Even if all your points are right and well researched and thought through and said in the best zingers that you can think of, if you have anger, you need to stop and deal with that before you can start again. The last one is a little bit harder for people to sometimes connect with sometimes, but I call it fascination with Islam. And that is really sort of an elevating of Islamic culture to the point where we can't challenge it. And we have that a lot, especially in the more liberal circles, that where we say, well, who are we to judge any other culture? And we just take that to just all the way to the extent of that logic, and we just say, well, we are not here to say anything negative or to challenge anyone or to push anyone, but we are here to appreciate different cultures and to understand. And so we have these powerless messages. Like they'll have dialogue. Well, let's invite an imam and let's invite a Christian and we'll shake hands and we'll smile at each other and we'll talk about tolerance and understanding and sympathy and we'll ignore all the differences that we have because, and that doesn't get anywhere. That doesn't get anywhere because the power of the gospel is transformative. It changes you. It takes you from where you are to somewhere else. Now, we're not saying that everybody has to look like me to be a Christian. That's not the gospel. But at the same time, everybody's going to change. And we can look at every culture, including our own culture, and we can say there are problems here. With the eyes of Jesus, when we look at our culture, we need change. So those are sort of let's look at ourselves and our own obstinate hearts, and let's get through that. And now let's look at some of the things you'll run into when it comes to the obstinate hearts of Muslims. Now, I want to pull out my Bible, and my dad is old-fashioned. He said it. I didn't say it. And he wants you to have a paper Bible, but I don't have one. I just use my phone because you can search it, and I can switch it between Arabic and Hebrew and English and Greek, and I can see the Strong's number. This is a great Bible. It's fine. Did you know that the original Bible didn't have a binding on one side? It was a scroll. You're using a binding. That's technology. Anyway, it's okay. You can keep your paper Bible with the binding. Okay, so what I wanted to read is in 2 Corinthians in chapter 3 and chapter 4, Paul uses this analogy of the veil. And I want to kind of extend on that analogy a little bit. And he talks about how because of the glory of Christ, we have a hope. Because of this hope, we are very bold. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12. Since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Now, I talked about fear. I talked about apathy. I talked about anger. And I talked about fascination with Islam. The answer to all of those things is love, and love is encapsulated. I think you can kind of get a lot of the ideas about balancing these three things: boldness, gentleness, and truth. Amen. If you leave out the gentleness and you go with boldness and truth, there's something missing. That's not quite love. You can go hit people over the head with the hammer of boldness and truth, and that's not quite what we're talking about. Or you leave out the truth. Let's be gentle and bold. But we won't focus on the hard truth. When you love somebody, you have to tell them the truth. And what was the other one? The boldness. You have no boldness, it's not going to work. But here we go. Since we have such a hope, we are very bold. Not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face, so that the Israelites might not gaze at the outcome of what was being brought to an end. But their minds were hardened. For to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ it is taken away. Yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. I'm making the analogy here. Paul is not talking specifically about Islam, but I believe the same kind of a veil falls over their hearts. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is Spirit, and when the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image, from one degree of glory to another. Therefore, having this ministry, is it okay if I just read a lot of scripture? Or do we have to stay on topic? Therefore, having this ministry, by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, but we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word, but by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled only to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Amen. I probably don't even need to make any comment on that, because that's just so appropriate. So when we talk about obstinate hearts, we're talking about hearts that are veiled by the God of this world that would keep them from seeing the glory of Christ. And there's many different flavors of Muslims. Muslims are not all the same, and they have different issues, and some of them are apathetic. They just don't really care. They don't care about Islam. They don't care about Christianity. They don't care about faith or heaven or hell. They're just working, get through the day, earn a little money, go watch TV, go be with their kids, whatever it is. That's one flavor of obstinacy. Another flavor is arguing. Just like we have people who love to argue, they have people who love to argue. And they have whole sections of the mosque activity that are dedicated to, their own arguments. So they study, how do you argue with a Christian? What Bible verses should you use? And what Quran verses should you use? Just like Christians have those seminars. To what Quran verse? Well, I don't know, I haven't read the Quran, but I know this surah that says this. Another one. This is a very difficult type of obstinate Muslim, because whenever you share the gospel with them, they say, oh yeah, we believe that too. Oh yeah, everything's the same. All religions are the same. And it's like, well, no, you don't believe that. How do you argue with that? There's an obstinate heart. And then there are people who seemingly are interested, but they're interested for false motives. They maybe want to get if the church will help them get immigration status, or the church will help them financially, or maybe they'll learn English if they hang out with these Christians, or maybe on and on. Maybe they see the girls in the church and they say, I want to be around those people. And so there's different varieties of obstinacy. Now, I'm not here to kind of address each one of these and what you do with them, but here's what I'm going to try to give you as advice. The first thing I want is right up there at the top. I need to check how long we go for here. Is it 5 to 6? Yeah. He who has ears to hear. Who said that? Jesus. What did he mean by that? He who has ears to hear, let him hear. What did he mean by that? It has to do with your heart. So does that mean everybody's going to hear? Quite the opposite. Some people are going to be able to hear you, and some people are not. One of the problems that we have a lot of times is we have this, especially in the West, we have friendship evangelism, and so we make friends with a Muslim, and we really begin to love them and get to know them, and that's wonderful, but they're just not interested. But we want them to be interested, so we keep talking to them, and but they're just not interested. I mean, sure, let's talk about it. They'd love to come over for dinner. They'd love to have you over for dinner, and then you could talk about things. etc., etc., and they can become great friends, but they're not interested. Well, personally, I love relational evangelism. You got to evangelize everybody that you have a relationship with, but you can't only do that. And I would not personally, I don't like to enter into a friendship with someone under false pretense that I'm interested in them as a person when all I'm trying to do is slip them the gospel somehow. That doesn't seem honest to me. So I love to have my friends, and if they never come to Christ, they're still my friends, but I still need to share the gospel outside of that, right? And I need to proclaim the gospel because many people don't have ears to hear it. But I want to find those who have ears to hear, so I share it, and I share it, and it gets tiring. And Jesus prepared us for this when he told us the parable about the scattering of the seed. And a lot of the seed didn't even fall on the field. A lot of it ended up in the path or over there on the rocks. And some of it did, but there were weeds, and they choked the seed out, and they didn't grow. And so Jesus prepared us that not everybody we share with is going to have ears to hear. So, if you're fishing, get one of those nets that has the big holes, like the big mesh, not the fine mesh, the big mesh, so that the little fish that you don't want will swim right through it. You only want to catch the big fish. That's what let ears to hear has him. Let he who has ears to hear, let him hear. That's what that means. Jesus used one of those nets. He sat there and told people stories. And some of the people were sitting there waiting to hear an argument that they could latch on to and oppose. Some of those Pharisees were listening to Jesus' stories, and they were trying to find something they could find fault with. But he was talking about seeds and birds and mustard and yeast and stuff that wasn't interesting to them, and so they left. And then a bunch of people sat there and they listened to his stories, and that just kind of washed over them, and they said, "Oh, wow, that was kind of nice," and they left. And at the end of the day, there was a few people that didn't leave. They sat at his feet and they said, "You're pricking something inside of us, and we want to know what it is." And those are the people that we call disciples. The people that followed him. The people that stayed with him. So many are called and few are chosen. And so keep on sharing the gospel. That's the first thing. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. So I just have a few points there to stop arguing. You know what? I stopped arguing. It's great. One of the things I do when people come at me with arguments, because I begin to hear the same arguments over and over again, and I think, maybe you're not really sincere, because I give you a sincere answer that should be satisfactory from a logical perspective, but you don't stop arguing. You just find that one didn't really take, so you just pick another one. So maybe you're not really sincere, so why am I wasting my time? So what I'll do is, if you come at me with an argument, I'll listen to your argument, and then I'll say, "Okay, can I ask you a question?" And then ask a question. Maybe my question is different. Maybe it has nothing to do with the argument that they just said. Or they'll argue, and I'll say, "Oh, that's interesting. What do you think about this?" And I'll tell them a story. Now, I just changed the subject. That's not fair. Well, yes, it is, because all authority on heaven and on earth was given to Jesus, and he gave it to me to go and make disciples, and I'm going to direct this conversation to more fruitful things than whatever argument you were talking about. But arguing rarely gets you where you want to go. Sometimes you just sidestep it. Or sometimes I'll say to people, there is a good answer to these questions that you bring up. Sometimes when you hear one side of a story, it's very convincing until you hear the other side. But to answer this question properly, it's going to take me some time, at least an hour. Or maybe you'll say, at least 20 minutes. Or maybe you'll say, I'll need to meet with you every Sunday for an hour for the next month to deal with these topics that you've brought up. And then you say to them, are you really interested in hearing those answers because I'd be happy to share them with you, but you can't interrupt me. And you can't change the subject. If you get an agreement, then you know that somebody is sincere. And if after the second time they're still coming, well, you've already have permission now, not to argue, but to teach. It says in 2 Timothy, the Lord's servant must be gentle towards all, able to teach, patient. So the gentleness that we need to have is the gentleness of a teacher. This isn't a dialogue. Sometimes we think because we all get one vote that everybody's opinion is equally valid. If any of you have been on Facebook, you know that that's true. Everybody thinks their opinion is equally valid. That is not actually true. There is truth and there's false. There are stupid questions. So what you have to do is you have to remember that you're a teacher, not because you're so great, not because of what you know, but because of who you know. And more importantly, who knows you, and you have to give yourself permission to speak with authority and to be a teacher. And we are here to teach. And so it's okay. The second thing is stop pleading. We sometimes, when we have that person that we really want them to come to Christ, we basically are begging them. We're begging them to accept. And sometimes we kind of twist their arm, or we try to make it easy for them to come. Remember what I said to Modibo when he said he wanted to be baptized? I said, can you afford it? I'm not here to try to make it easier for you or make you think that it'll be easier than it really is. I want to prepare you for struggle because I want fruit that will last. And so we need to stop pleading or making it easy. And you know what we need to start doing? Praying more. I told my brother a story about a conversation that I had when I was in my own strength and I wasn't praying. I was just giving arguments and answers and reasons because I've done this before and I was on autopilot and it started going badly and they started getting angry. And then I started to realize how I wasn't relying on the Lord. I started to pray and then I never had this happen before, but God gave me an image of knowledge, of information about this man's life. And I all of a sudden knew it with so much confidence that when I shared it with him, everything changed. There was a sign. I'm going to have a workshop about types and stories. And that's based on the insight that Paul has in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 when he says, Greeks look for wisdom, Jews demand miraculous signs. So one reason why dreams, the Jews are Semites, they're Hebrews, they're just like the Arabs in their mindset, and they're looking for signs. They already believe in God. They don't need logic that proves the existence of God. They need a sign from the Lord that would say, this is the truth, follow this. And so this word of knowledge in that case was just the sign that this guy needed. How did you know that about me? Argument over. I'm convinced. So start praying more and letting God speak to your mind in the midst of a conversation with a Muslim. Maybe you might be moved to say something that doesn't make sense. One time I was moved to share a scripture with a young man that had no connection, at least I couldn't see any connection with the conversation that we had. But I just went with it, and all of a sudden I realized that it was connected, and it was so amazing. It was beautiful, and that man did end up coming to the Lord. That was the story of Semih in Turkey, another young man who came to the Lord. Tell stories. People cannot argue with stories. If you argue with stories, how silly is that? Storytelling is Jesus' approach. It took me a long time to realize that Jesus never handed out tracts. He never invited people to Bible studies. He didn't do all the things that we do. He didn't go preaching the four spiritual laws or arguing with people, at least not very much. He did do some arguing. But his primary mode of evangelism was telling stories. And I realized that that's very appropriate culturally, and so I began to build up a library of stories that you could tell. Now, you don't have to attend my plenary session. I know that much more interesting to go to Amani Mustafa's, or to the breakout session. She's going to be the other talker at the same time. So you probably want to go there. But in mine, I'll be sharing with you some of my stories. But you have your own stories. The Bible is full of stories. And if you tell stories, sometimes an Easterner connects better with a story than with an argument. And so that's another thing we can do. Another thing is interpret dreams. Now, I don't want to get into theology about if you're a cessationalist or whatever. But I can tell you that if someone comes to you with a dream and they say, I had this dream and I was asleep in a building and a man in white woke me up and he said, follow me, and then I realized that the building was on fire and I followed the man and he led me out of the building and I was saved. I can guarantee you that if you are a Christian, you know how to interpret that dream. And if you don't know, then go back to the point before that and pray. Because God can lead you to give wisdom in the interpretation of dreams. Because it's like Daniel said, I cannot interpret the dream, but the God I serve, He can interpret your dream, and you can use that for the benefit of the gospel. So all these things, and finally I also want to just remind you, many Muslims experience oppression from demons. We don't have time to get into that. It's a whole other teaching. It's part of Islam. But praying for people in terms of their demonic oppression can be one of the most powerful tools that we have to reach Muslims for Christ, and most of us never even think of it. So those are some things and just some pointers. How can we overcome that obstinacy? So let's close in prayer on. Father, we thank you for reaching our obstinate hearts. We thank you, Lord, that even though we were blind and deaf and dull, you just beat down the door of resistance and came to us. While we were still enemies of yours, you died for us. And we ask you, Lord, to use us to call other people to yourself, that their veil may be lifted, that their eyes would be open, and that they would come to know you. Amen. Through the love of Jesus Christ. Amen. In His name, amen.